want to buy the stuff. You buy 35 pounds, you've got yourself a bomb like Hiroshima. And the key in terms of the challenge we face now is that unless America figures out a way to restore its moral authority in the world by essentially believing in American oaths and sticking with it, rather than, you know, a backdoor secret foreign policy that ruins our relationships with friends and undermines our credibility and our status, unless we do that, we are going to probably have a real problem. And the Armageddon test, just so you know, is one of the main characters. It's a weave of them, who's the guy in the government who's responsible essentially for getting to the uranium before the terrorists do. What he wants to do out of desperation, frankly, is send teams out just to find out how easy it is to buy this stuff on the world black market right now, to buy it, have these teams sent out by the U.S. government, buy it, and bring it back into the United States to show our vulnerability as well, to shock the beast, the United States government and the world community, to show exactly the nature of the threat, especially the nature of the threat, with America's moral standing now in the basement.
What happens?
Well, ultimately, he gets thwarted. In twists and turns, he tries mightily, but the bureaucratic energies of the United States to stand in his way, and importantly, the fact that the United States simply can't embrace a level of truth, the government, like that, and that ultimately what undermines them. And interestingly, Amy, at the end of the process, this fellow, Ralph Mullet Larson, says, one of the real problems is secrecy. The fact is, it's destructive. Let's get everything out in daylight. This hyper-secrecy culture that the government has slipped into and, frankly, carried forward is what ultimately will kill us.
He meets with Stephen Hadley. He meets with Mike McConnell. He meets with Michael Hayes, the top intelligence people.
He's a top guy, yeah. He's a top guy.
But he gets nowhere.
Essentially, no. And even though they admit to him, we have no plan. We have no plan on this score, the most important ostensible issue of this period. The United States at this point is lessened. And the fact is, the world, much less American people, can't afford for us to be in this reduced status because, frankly, you can't herd cats when you're the United States at this moment.
Speaking of uranium, did your investigations lead you to who is really behind the Niger yellow cake uranium theory that Saddam Hussein was buying?
Well, you know, it seems like it was an echo chamber of those Italian forged documents. And, you know, and frankly, what's interesting is that you put that on one side, really a false claim. And then there's another disclosure in the book right on the point of the real uranium threat, is that I show that in terms of Georgia and Russia, which is now blowing up, is that there's a huge crisis in 2003 when there's a smuggling route from Russia through Georgia with highly enriched uranium, the real good stuff, the stuff that is used in bombs. We challenged the Russians at that point. Again, the United States is, you know, the status is such the Russians just almost ignore us, but they said, look, we're on the case, and they say, we've got it handled. Ultimately, in 2006, there's a second incident. It's the same network. The Russians won't tell us that. What it shows is that ultimately uranium might have been smuggled across 3 years there. This is exactly the nature of the crisis. The United States, being the black hat in much of the world rather than the white hat, cannot lead on this most crucial issue. And as you can see from this current situation with Georgia, you know, Bush says this or that, Putin all but laughs at him. Like, and you're telling me what, considering what you've done? Ultimately, you're down in the mud with us now. Get used to it. And really the challenge in this election season is how do we go about the difficult process when there's so much collected economic and military power in one place in America to restore moral energy. I frankly tell people you should go read stuff from Martin Luther King or Gandhi. They'll help you. They'll help you figure out the way it is actually done, and it takes values that, frankly, the United States government is anathema to embrace.
Speaking of young people, you go to Guantanamo, at least you talk about what's going on there, and particularly focus on one young man.
There's an extraordinary story. The man who is really the unknown character that creates that Supreme Court case, Boumediene, that restores habeas rights to Guantanamo detainees. Just most recent case, just ruled. I actually get in the case of that man. He's a guy, a baker from Afghanistan, who was swept up as they dropped the, you know, the bounty literature, you know, feed your village, give us someone from the Taliban. He is innocent. What I did here, Amy, is I used my sources to get actually into the classified so-called information on this man. It is utterly absent. It is non-existent. What happened here is that by virtue of this one innocent man's status, various twists and turns unfolded that finally causes a self-correction, a modest but important one, where the United States, again, is forced by the Supreme Court to embrace the great writ of habeas corpus. The book, in this way, shows what single individuals can do, not just this man, Gizawi, the baker, but his lawyer, Candace Gorman, an extraordinary advocate who really keeps him alive. Right now, just so you know, I talked to Candace, Gizawi, the man who created such change, is dying in Guantanamo, and she is fighting desperately to keep him alive against the resistance, frankly, of much of those in the U.S. government.
And the Holocaust survivor's son, the military tribunal judge?
That's quite a story. He's the military tribunal judge who looks over the Gizawi case when it comes in front of the tribunal. He's kind of a ringer because he's actually a former intelligence guy among mostly lawyers in this process. And he looks at the evidence and said, there isn't any here on this guy. He rules he's not an enemy combatant. That fellow, Stephen Abraham, again, another basic, heroic, traditional American character trying to restore America to its proper place, says, I'm not going to back off. This man is innocent. One innocent man is all it takes to stop a system in America the way it's supposed to work. He's the guy who basically pushes back. Abraham is a Holocaust survivor's son, as you say, and he says it's about justice. He all but gets fired from Guantanamo, but ultimately, years later, he files a deposition saying, I'm a credible witness, I was actually a judge. That causes the Supreme Court to flip, grant certiorari to the case Boumediene, and that ultimately is sort of the heartening part of the book. Americans are taking hold of this issue all across the country to say, this government doesn't really represent me, and I'm going to do something about it with my own actions.
And finally, the UN Refugee Commissioner that you profiled.
Yeah, she's an amazing character, too. Wendy Chamberlain. She was the former Pakistani ambassador under Bush, but she moved away from all of that, becomes the Refugee Commissioner. And Wendy says something extraordinary. She says, you know, at day's end, if we're true to our oath, we don't really have enemies, certainly no enemies that can't be easily defeated. If we want to be secure, America has to start embracing a kind of authenticity, to say we're not going to do backdoor ugly things that end up ruining our status in the world. The oaths, the values are strong enough. If you believe in them, the world will bend toward you, even on the most specific issue of information that'll help us be secure. Look, ultimately, it may be too much to ask the world to want us to succeed. We have so much wealth, so much power, but they can't want us to fail. They can't want us to have our comeuppance by virtue of the actions of the government, or we will get our comeuppance. That's part of the theme of the book. It's a bit of a kind of clarion call as to where America might yet go.
What is the way of the world?
The way of the world is something Benazir Bhutto says to me just 10 days before she dies. You know, she talks about her life, and she talks about this sort of interesting fact of her being a Muslim woman who has led men. And she says, well, you know, I let them think they're saving me, but of course I'm saving them. She says, but oddly, that's where the problem starts, because then I say, I saved you and now here's what I want, and make it transactional. See, that's a lie. She says, the way of the world when it really works is such that we save each other. Everyone rises together. That's always been the tradition of humanity. And she gets this at the end of her life. She sees it. And she also sees that maybe she won't get to that up ahead, that land that she sees so close. And that's really, again, a reestablishing of things people know as American tradition.
Ron Suskind, I want to thank you very much for joining us. His book is The Way of the World, a story of truth and hope in an age of extremism. If you'd like a copy of today's broadcast, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Berkshire, Hoda Kadus, Aaron Mata, Angela Kama, Jeffrey Hagerman, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, Hanema Sood, Ravi Karen. Happy birthday, Silky Shah, and Mimi Goodman. Thanks for joining us.